right, everybody. Hello, good morning. My name is Adrienne Tsikewa, and yes, as Kelsey mentioned, I've been talking about kind of my own process of what do I do with my data. Let's see, does this work? Because it's not. But then, so this will work now on, okay. All right, great. So first, before we start, I definitely want to acknowledge a few people. First one is Cordelia Hui, who is a cultural resource manager with the Tribal Archives Office under the Zuni Cultural and Educational Resources Center, and also Brittany Garcia, who works with Cordelia as the Tribal Archives Records Management Assistant, and also Curtis Quam, who is the director of our tribal museum, the Ashiwi Awan Museum and Heritage Center, and also to the organizers, the great organizers and the host of the conference. Great, so yes. I always kind of start out with my presentations with like obviously who I am, so my positionality. So I am a Zuni Pueblo tribal member and also a heritage language learner. I will discuss, give more information about Zuni here in the next slides, but more information about me. So I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, and not actually in Zuni Pueblo, which is in western New Mexico. So it's about a 10 hours drive. But I grew up visiting Zuni frequently, but did not grow up speaking Zuni or having it spoken to me. So that is why I got into linguistics, and I'm now a PhD candidate at the University of California, Santa Barbara in the linguistics department. So for there, definitely my research interests focus on language documentation, sociocultural linguistics, applied linguistics, definitely language reclamation and revitalization. So I specifically chose UCSB because of their language documentation focus. And I know I wrote in my application that I wanted to, personal statement that I wanted to write a grammar of the Zuni language. But it's also through my studies at UCSB, learn that language documentation emphasizes that data be deposited in an open access archive. So I knew that this was going to be problematic, and I'm going to address why in the next slide. So I knew it's been problematic for my community because of the previous research done on Zuni. So this led me wanting to learn more about language archives in order to become better informed to be informed about any language data my research produces. Just to learn more about it so that I can where in a sense, like what am I going to do with my data? Where would it go? So as part of my professional development, as Haley mentioned in her talk on Wednesday, I was a recent intern with the Language Vitality Initiative under the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage, where I specifically wanted to, took the time to learn more about the language archives there, and definitely visited the National Anthropological Archives there, and looked at some of the Zuni collection, not all of them. Yeah. Yes, so about Zuni, and in the background is a picture of our Corn Mountain. Just to show what it looks like. It is kind of a desert area. So we call it in our language, Halona Itiwana, the middle place. It is one of 19 Pueblo communities located in western New Mexico. So the southwest United States is about 20 minutes away from Arizona. Out of those pueblos, it's the most geographically isolated. It's also called, and for locals, at Shiwina. Traditionally, we're an agrarian society. This next quote is from the tribal website. So traditional Zuni life is oriented around a matrilineal clan system and a complex ceremonial system based on a belief in the ancestors' ancient ones. There are 6 specialized esoteric groups, each with restricted membership and its own priesthood, devoted to worship a particular group of supernaturals. So this complex ceremonial system obviously fascinated earlier anthropologists and is the subject matter of published texts from the late 1800s and early 1900s. And I have a few of them listed. I guess is that my right or up there? So these publications are the reasons why I knew an open access repository was going to be problematic for any language data or any of my research. And the other side has some quotes. So the first quote is from an outsider who wrote about Zuni's experience with anthropologists. It says, The Indians began to realize that they had been betrayed by anthropologists. That is, some of them had written about aspects of Zuni life that had been told in confidence. And the second quote is from fellow Zuni scholars, Miranda Bellardi Lewis and Sarah Kostelecki. The information, referring to these publications, the information and knowledge collected was not the author's information to share or the readers to know. So this goes into information. So these Zuni scholars also discuss information practices in Zuni. So we understand and accept that there is some information that is known by only a select few in our village. And that goes to the title of the slide, You're Not Supposed to Know. So I grew up being told, like, you're not supposed to know when asking about the ceremonies or religious doings. You've learned to accept that as just as a community member. So that is where I also enter my own personal research boundaries. So I made it very clear to my department and everyone else, like, I refuse to examine any language related to cultural, religious, esoteric practices that Zuni does, because that is not universal knowledge. I don't have access to it, and I know the repercussions for doing so. So next, going on to our language, our autonym for it is Shiwima. It is a linguistic isolate. Right now, our community is in, we're only just in one community. We're not spread out over a few villages or we're kind of just in one area. So it is a bilingual situation, Zuni and English, or Zunglish, as it's called. In terms of its language vitality status, it is threatened according to the endangeredlanguages.com or Endangered Languages Project, or vulnerable according to UNESCO. So it is, in terms of, in comparison to other Native American languages, they're fairly healthy. We have a good amount of speakers of all ages, and it really, but there is definitely a noticeable shift to English, with the noticeable loss of intergenerational language transmission. So this is where, my dissertation, I am focusing on tentatively titled Zuni English Family Language Practices, an examination of language shift and language ideologies. So my dissertation involves interviews facilitated by a first speaker, or native speaker, fluent speaker, resulting in bilingual recordings. So in these recordings are to be archived with the Zuni Tribal Archives Office. So I chose the Tribal Archives Office so that, this is, I felt, in the sense that what the research that my community needs at this time. And so having it archived with this, locally, this resource can be close to home. I am also not obligated to deposit my dissertation recordings because of my funding. I didn't receive any kind of funding to say, like, hey, I have to go to a bigger archive. So I'm definitely going to talk next about the research process at Zuni. But so there's no kind of established research protocols. I think most people kind of know that you have to contact the local government first, the tribal government. So yes, researchers contact the tribal government. The governor's office may reach out after receiving the proposal, reach out to other tribal entities, such as the archive or museum, for feedback. And if they approve your research, they then provide supporting documentation, such as that letter of support that is still needed in definitely, U.S. universities for that IRB process. So my process included contacting the tribal government to request a meeting. I had one set up, but then I was rerouted or kind of contacted me, like, well, technically, because your research involves language, you need to go through the Zuni Language Board. So yeah, found out that they actually have authority over any research proposals concerning involving the Zuni language. So I presented to the board twice, last summer and then this previous summer, giving them an update. Got human subjects approval through my institution in fall last year. Obviously COVID did a lot in terms of actually with me meeting people. So it's been a little bit of delay in terms of this whole process with me just going on with my dissertation. Anyways, so along with that, I have always had, I'm going to flip these last two, continuous communication with the museum. As I was previously a youth summer intern there about almost 20 years ago. I put youth in quotes because I was, like, that summer I was on my going to be 21, so just barely a youth. But also met with the Tribal Archives Office this past summer as well. So So especially, Cordelia, Brittany, Curtis, they all definitely be like, there's something, all mention a need for established research protocols. So definitely when talking to Cordelia and Brittany about it, they suggested using the Hopi research protocols, or, and advocated using it as a model for establishing a research process. So that's where I'm going to go into my suggestions now to how we can develop these research projects, or hopefully, I guess, this more suggestions is to probably going to be more relevant to the actual tribal government entities. But so my suggestions are to use our website to detail research proposal logistics for any researchers. These logistics should incorporate human rights themes outlined in the protocols for Native American archival materials. These are just some of them, not all of them, including, I put kind of these ones that are mostly relevant. The important to my research now, or this presentation now, the importance of in consultation with and concurrence of tribal communities in decisions and policies, the need to recognize and provide special treatment for culturally sensitive materials, rethinking public accessibility and use of some materials, the role of intellectual and cultural property rights, and the recognition of community-based research protocols and contracts. So Hopi, for those that don't know, Hopi Tribe is in Arizona. It's about 3 hours away from Zuni west. In terms of their culture, they're very similar in cultural practices as well. So using them as a model, they're actually their protocols is titled Hopi Protocols for Research, Publications, and Recordings, Motion, Visual, Sound, Multimedia, and Other Mechanical Devices. And this is what they outline, this is what say, if for any kind of research proposals, this is what your proposal needs to include. The intent and benefit of research to the tribe. So that was already definitely talked about from one of our previous governors, Malcolm Bawakati, in 2002. Any kind of risks, we know, most people know that with IRBs, that they ask you to put the kind of risk, but they're mostly talking about psychological, but for me, they should also include possible impacts on the cultural, social, economic, and political well-being of the community. So tribal consent, obviously, you need consent from the tribal government, and the individual, but sometimes that can also include a family or clan and or a village. These logistics should include the rights to privacy, detailing how the privacy of the tribe will be recognized and protected, detailing confidentiality, how it will be protected, where raw data materials will be deposited or stored at completion of projects, and how the researchers' contractual legal obligations will constitute a breach of confidentiality, if any. Also detailing their use of recording devices. So once again, what the research plans to do with the recording information presently and potential future uses before the recording takes place. Details ownership. So definitely going on to say the Hopi tribe has the right to prevent publication of intellectual resources, which is unauthorized, sensitive, misrepresentative, or stereotypical, the right to require deposit of raw materials or data, working papers, and or products in a tribal designated repository. They also have the right to deny any research proposal. So fair and appropriate terms, also just compensation, obviously, paid for their time, but this could also include a copy of the research findings, acknowledgement as author, co-author, or contributor. So I put one of the key principles of the Decade of Indigenous Languages is nothing for us without us. But I'm going to quote Tlingit scholar Hune Lance Twitchell, who recently posted on his page, it's like nothing about us without us, or to put another way, nothing about them without them. So Indigenous co-authors are primary authors for all texts about their peoples, languages, and ways of living. Fair and appropriate term also includes royalties, copyrights, patents, and trademarks. Okay. These protocols also detail the Indian preference in employment or training. This is kind of a BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs policy as well, so it kind of just follows that. Also, the review of product or research results or study. So a detailed process of how tribe will have an opportunity to review and have input in the product of results before publication. And I put this picture next to it, and it was about conference about TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, that took place earlier this year. And one thing that struck me about it was, kind of with the arrows, what it said about Indigenous data sovereignty. So all speakers who present data that were gathered from Indigenous peoples will be required to submit a form that provides evidence that the Indigenous peoples governments with whom you are working are fully informed and consent to all the information being shared during this conference. The summit is not a place to share sacred forms of data. Tribals' approvals of Indigenous research shared at this conference are mandatory. So when I saw that, I was like, well, this will never happen at a linguistics conference. Like, I can just imagine the pushback, if any. But I feel that when it comes, like, this maybe become the norm, or, this may be included in some of the future conferences. So be aware. So to follow the suggestions, so yes, develop research protocols to be included actually in the Zuni tribal constitution, and also to develop a research oversight advisory group to review research proposals. And, a suggestion made from Cordelia and Brittany was that more representation there's more representation needed within what we call ZCRAT, the Zuni Cultural Resources Advisory Team. They're to be just a select few people that look over them, but there's could be more representation with that group as well. Okay, so I guess to conclude, or where do we need to go from here? And we talking, everyone who kind of works with Indigenous communities or linguists, language archives, language documentation. So know and promote the International Decade of Indigenous Language Objectives. So I see a lot of these for the presentation, you're actually doing this, but not necessarily referencing the objectives for it as well. So the first one is to draw attention to the critical loss of Indigenous languages, provide access to sustainable, accessible, workable, and affordable Indigenous knowledge records, language technologies and media, support Indigenous peoples in safeguarding their intangible heritage expressed through language, songs, myths, word games, poetry, and other oral traditions. I put that as a little note, awareness with the critical lens of intellectual property. Support and encourage public and private funding and direct investments in the revitalization, support, access, and promotion of Indigenous languages by targeting particularly the creation of new content, as well as training and employment opportunities for Indigenous language users. Another, one way that this could be done is through another objective is promote Indigenous knowledge exchanges with science and research, provide training, recognition of linguistic competency, and employment opportunities for Indigenous language teachers and pre-service and for translators and interpreters, and to provide them with appropriate training and learning materials. Okay. So, and also, the Hopi Tribes Protocol for Research, Publication, Recordings address fundamental concepts of Indigenous data sovereignty. So, what is Indigenous data sovereignty? So it centers on Indigenous collectives' rights to data about our peoples, territories, lifeways, and natural resources. Let's skip ahead, and these rights include the rights of Indigenous peoples to determine the means of collection, access, analysis, interpretation, management, dissemination, and reuse of data pertaining to the Indigenous peoples from whom it has been derived or to whom it relates. So it's definitely addressing the reuse of data. So it's, the future reuse of my dissertation data. So proposal should also address the recommended logistics. And just to kind of go to the tribal archives, some other policies that said depositor does not own data. So I don't own this data either if I do it, but the contributor participant does. So they have to sign off something else that they would have to, any kind of reuse would have to contact them and not necessarily me, but I'll obviously definitely cite that as that. But yes, that is it. Thank you.